Thank you, Your Worship. The first item is a presentation. Staff Sergeant David Stewart and the Coquitlam RCMP Traffic Services have been recognized for the outstanding traffic team effort and a 2010 award from the BC Association of Chiefs of Police. And we have a presentation to that effect.
Well, it's my honor to welcome you all here and to thank you on behalf of Council for what you've done. This is a great recognition. I'd like to take a few moments to recognize you on this award. The Traffic Safety Committee of the BC Association of Chiefs of Police presented Sergeant Dave Stewart with Outstanding Traffic Team Effort 2010 Award, an award that symbolizes not only all the hard work done by traffic members at the Coquitlam detachment, but also strongly indicates that roads are becoming safer in our community. I'd like to congratulate all the RCMP members involved in traffic safety, particularly Staff Sergeant Dave Stewart, on this significant achievement. I myself have worked with many of these members on numerous occasions promoting road safety and their promotion of road safety, particularly through the city's school walkability program. We've always been impressed with their dedication. I think I can speak for all of Council when I say that we're proud of the achievements recognized by this award. The accomplishments are significant and they are life-saving in our community, and on behalf of Council, I want to thank you very much for your work in this community and an absolutely wonderful award of recognition for that work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Worship. Good evening, Your Worship, members of Council. It's certainly my pleasure to be here to represent Superintendent Wilcott, who unfortunately sends his regrets, is at another meeting and is unable to attend this evening. Prior to turning it over to Staff Sergeant Stewart,
yes,
we were lucky enough to have him promoted and stay on board with Coquitlam RCMP, which is very much to our liking, and we're very proud of that. It's certainly my position as a member of our senior management team at the detachment to thank you for your support, that of Your Worship and Council. With respect to the services that we provide in the community, it's certainly important to the community, traffic safety, and nobody less than this unit sitting here recognizes that and has done a remarkable job representing us at our detachment with respect to traffic. So I'll turn it over to Staff Sergeant Stewart.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mayor Stewart, honored members of Council, ladies and gentlemen. I stand before you as part of a very distinguished group. In 2010, the Coquitlam traffic section was basically at half strength with 9 members. The officers you see before you are the members of the 2010 team and current members of the traffic team today. I feel very honored and distinguished to be included amongst them. I am only the team leader. They are the people who do the work out on the road every day. Those are the people who really need the accolades for this award. This was no easy task. With only half strength of the unit members, we had to adjust to trends that we saw before us. We used our crime analyst and we used intelligent-led policing to focus on causation factors of motor vehicle collisions, one of those primarily being impaired driving. The detachment itself, using a priority for impaired driving, being one of the things that constantly causes serious accidents and fatals, processed 355 impaired drivers in 2010. The members of the traffic unit did 124 of those files. That's many hours of hard police work, dealing with people on the roadside, doing reports to Crown Council, and then following up with communications to ensure that these people appear before the courts. In September of 2010, that changed a little bit, where the provincial government of British Columbia took a serious look at impaired drivers and focused on the immediate roadside driving prohibition. That gave us a more effective tools to deal with people who found them in a situation of impaired driving, unfortunately for them, but it also increased our impaired awareness. And these members before you, I would like them all to stand now, please. And I would ask them to step forward. They, when I call their names, totally 8,063 traffic contacts that they had within 1 year, 7,294 violations, 769 warnings were issued where it wasn't appropriate. A focus on impaired driving and distracted driving led to our success. Also, a focus on seatbelts, intersections, excessive speed, unsafe speed, and criminal interdiction. I present to you the current and 2010 members of the Coquitlam RCMP Traffic Unit. Corporal Robert McDonald, would you please step forward? Constable Matthew Sakeley, Constable Devinder Lally, Constable Christopher Duncan, Constable Melissa Ryberger, and our senior constable, Constable Merle Stoos. Mayor and Council, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Coquitlam Traffic Section. Thank you very much for your time today and for your invitation, for your support, for the work that we do in the community of and city of Coquitlam. Thank you very much.
Well, I must say I've stopped a couple of times during traffic operations radar. Voluntarily, I voluntarily stopped. Voluntarily, and really appreciate the focus on specific locations and specific issues associated with traffic accidents and the kinds of injuries that can happen. And perhaps I know more this year than last year about the kinds of injuries that can happen when motorists and pedestrians get in contact with each other. So thank you very much.
In closing, we have to appreciate the support of our officers, Superintendent Claude Wilcott and Inspector Doug Smith that's here with us also tonight. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening.
Annie, thank you. Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Your Worship. Next item, item 2, is the minutes of the regular council meeting held Monday, December 12th. Recommendations to approve those minutes.
Please feel free to leave. Yes, thank you. Moved by Councillor Reamer, seconded by Councillor Robinson. All in favor, opposed, carried.
Item 3 is the minutes of the regular council meeting held Wednesday, December 14th, with the recommendation to approve.
By Councillor Asmundson, seconded by Councillor Robinson. All in favor, Reamer, sorry, all in favor, opposed, carried.
Item 4 is the minutes of the Maillardville Commercial and Cultural Revitalization Task Force meeting of Thursday, November 3rd. Recommendation to receive.
Moved by Councillor Reamer, seconded by Councillor Robinson. All in favor, opposed, carried.
Item 5 is the minutes of the Sustainability Environmental Advisory Committee meeting of Wednesday, November 23rd. Recommendation to receive.
Moved by Councillor Reamer, seconded by Councillor Nicholson. All in favor, opposed, carried.
Item of business arising out of that committee's meeting is a recommendation to council concerning the pesticide use bylaw. The recommendation from the committee is that Coquitlam develop a pesticide use bylaw that incorporates a strong education and outreach component and which monitors the success of the program but does not include a permitting process. We have some introductory comments by our General Manager of Engineering and Public Works.
Thanks, Your Worship. With adoption of this recommendation, staff will be producing such a bylaw along with reporting out on the monitoring program. I'll just be very brief in my comments. This has been a very significant process. An awful lot of work has gone into this process, and from a staff level, we want to thank Councillor Reamer for having chaired this group. Councillor Asmundson is now the new chair, but we feel that we are at the end of a process that has reconsidered where we were before in terms of potential permitting. We've had a lot of internal discussion regarding city operations and how to accommodate that, and we are comfortable that we can live with what is being advised to council by the CIAC committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Moved by Councillor Robinson, second by Councillor Reamer. The rest staff, the recommendation before us. Is there any discussion? Councillor Sikora.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mayor, you had a discussion with the provincial government about them banning the pesticide. Have you lately at all? I believe you did.
We don't actually get to have discussions with the government, but I did have discussions with a number of members of government, and they're still kind of contemplating the process. They completed their public consultation, and I know it was part of the UBCM discussions again about whether or not that could happen, but I don't know if it's impending or
I'll
pending.
certainly, certainly support the bylaw coming forward, but I'll have great problems supporting it unless we have a provincial government banning it, because we in Coquitlam cannot enforce it, neither can we get it taken off the shelves. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. And Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Certainly when this came to Council previously, there was a lot of conversation about the permitting process. That was a major stumbling block for many of us. The other area that there was a lot of discussion about, and it's not clear to me whether it's encompassed in the recommendation going forward, is whether or not the permission or the lack of restriction that existed in the previous draft bylaw, allowing the use of pesticides in, for example, the Rose Garden, and I think on some civic facilities and that kind of thing, was an issue for a lot of us. It's not clear to me whether we are allowing that to continue or whether that permitting is also continues to be permitted.
Your Worship.
The question is there permission in there for the permitting of the permitted?
Thanks, Your Worship. There are no permits, if you will. There are no permitting. There is only one exemption contemplated in this bylaw, and that is for health and safety only. Medians, rose gardens, and what have you, would not fall under that kind of a consideration. Hogweed, for example, we may have to use it for human health and safety reasons. That would be the only criteria in which there would be an exemption under this bylaw.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. And Councillor O'Neill.
Yes, I'm because I wasn't part of the former council and part of the discussion that led to this recommendation, I'm inclined to wait until the pesticide use bylaw actually comes forward and then make then let's discuss that in depth at the time or look at it with some scrutiny. And I wanted to make this statement because in both the campaigns in which I ran for council over the last 2 years, this has been an issue, and I've been asked about my position on it, and so people might be expecting that I have something to say about it today. I don't. I'll wait till the bylaw comes forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Reamer.
Thank you.
Chaired the committee.
Yes, thanks. We had our Environment and Sustainability Advisory Committee met again because of the response from Council on our first recommendation, which did include the permitting process. So the committee got back together and we discussed it. And while they still do believe in the permitting process, they were willing to exceed that particular issue. One of their concerns is measuring the success of the pesticide bylaw. And so they had thought in their minds that they could measure if we had a permitting process, in that we would know how many people are not meeting with success through natural means, etc. So that was an issue, and but that is why that we're coming forward now recommending acceptance of this bylaw, but without the permitting process. I just want to clarify one thing, because I just received an email actually from a citizen concerning the provincial process. And the provincial committee is currently considering feedback from the public and stakeholders on the cosmetic use of pesticides, and the committee expects to table its report during the spring sitting of the Legislative Assembly. So I just wanted to pass that along to you. Thank you.
That's more helpful. Thank you. Any other discussion? Okay. Motion is drafted bylaw. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 6 is the minutes of the Tri-Cities Homelessness Task Group meeting of Friday, December 2nd. The recommendations to receive those minutes.
Moved by Councillor Robinson, second by Councillor Nicholson. All in favor? Opposed? Carried.
Item 7 is fourth and final reading of City of Coquitlam Subdivision and Development Servicing Amendment Bylaw 4264. The recommendations that Council give fourth and final reading to City of Coquitlam Subdivision and Development Servicing Amendment Bylaw 4264.
Moved by Councillor Asmundson, seconded by Councillor O'Neill. Discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 8 is fourth and final reading of Building Bylaw Amendment Bylaw number 4238. The recommendations that Council give fourth and final reading to Building Bylaw Amendment Bylaw 4238.
Moved by Councillor Reamer, second by Councillor Nicholson. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 9 is final reading to zoning amendment bylaw number 4253 and the development permit authorization for a 4-story apartment building in the Coquitlam neighborhood located at 626 and 630 Coma Lake Avenue. Recommendations that Council give fourth and final reading to City of Coquitlam zoning amendment bylaw 4253 and that Council approve the signing and sealing of the DP for this address, these two addresses, and permit the Mayor and City Clerk to execute it.
Moved by Councillor Asmundson, second by Councillor Reamer. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 10 is proposed road cancellation and its application for a portion of Woolridge Street. This is bylaw 4206. The recommendations of Council give first, second, and third readings to City of Coquitlam Highway Dedication Cancellation bylaw number 4206 pertaining to 1100 Woolridge Avenue, and direct that bylaw 4206 be advertised in accordance with the Charter.
Moved by Councillor Nicholson, second by Councillor Robinson. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 11 requests an extension of the approval period for fourth and final reading for zoning amendment bylaw number 4118-2010. This is for an RT3 triplex and quadruplex residential zone. Recommendations that Council extend the 1-year period between third and final readings of zoning amendment bylaw number 4118 for an additional 1-year period.
So moved.
Moved by Councillor Sikora, second by Councillor O'Neill. I'm looking to the then chair of the committee, Councillor Reid.
Thank you. Through you to Mr. McIntyre. When we have a lot of very old duplexes that are illegally fourplexes now, by giving this more latitude, will this in any way, I don't think it will, but I'm just checking, will this in any way allow someone with a duplex zoned illegal fourplex, will it allow them to be able to come in and try and rezone their illegal fourplex to a legal fourplex?
Mr. McIntyre.
Yes, thank you, Worship. That's a really interesting question. I guess anything's possible, and we know those sort of duplexes exist out there. I guess it'd be a couple of checks and balances on that. Remember, through the housing choice, the RT3 were sort of focused in the attached residential area for one thing. So it'd have to be in that area. The second thing is, certainly any property owner is able to submit a rezoning application, and it's for the city to consider that, and ultimately for council to decide whether to approve it. And I would dare say that if you're going to retroactively rezone a property to legitimize what may not have been consistent with in compliance with the previous zoning, there may be some terms and conditions around that. Like, for example, would we want to do an assessment and make sure it meets building code? I think we've seen that in some of the older developments around town on occasion, like where land use contracts have dropped away. We want to make sure that things are consistent with the code.
But Mr. McIntyre, you and I had this conversation. I do not want these old 30 or 40-year-old duplexes that are being illegally used as fourplexes or fiveplexes or whatever they are to have the ability to come in and legitimize themselves. If they want to do that, they need to redevelop. Otherwise, we're just not forwarding, we're not moving our city forward. So if we can't have a definitive answer to this, I'd like to defer it until we do.
Your Worship, a more direct answer would be such an application coming forward would be reviewed and could be either supported or not.
Pardon?
Could be supported or not, and ultimately that would be council's decision to make. And if it was for something that was not compliance with the zoning, you know, it may not stand a very good chance of success.
A couple of comments. I don't think that I've ever heard enough support on council for for a prospective applicant to get approval for this zoning if such were to happen. But secondly, the motion before us is just to extend the 1-year time period.
I understand what it is, Your Worship.
No, so I don't know that deferring the extension would serve a purpose, because other than killing the bylaw, if we don't extend it.
Or redoing it so that it prohibits someone. Yes. And that's what I'm asking. If we, I mean, we don't have to jump on this tonight. We can jump on it next week. The point is, let's not, we're always doing stuff in a hurry, and I want to do something right. We're at a redevelopment now of our older part of our city, and I want to make sure that we don't reward those folks that have been taking advantage of the neighborhoods for all these years. So I'm not planning on doing that.
No, absolutely. And
so that's my question. If we're absolutely not sure, or we haven't got all the information and all the wrinkles out, let's not do it till next week. That's how I feel, Your Worship, so whatever.
Since this is not the final approval, one way forward would be to pass the extension and have an additional motion that simply gives direction to staff to ensure that nothing in this bylaw makes it easier for duplexes to be, fourplexes to be rezoned. And if there is anything for staff to make the final make changes to the bylaw before it's brought back for final reading.
Yeah, that probably is most appropriate, because I don't think we have a lot of choice. But if we don't pass it tonight, it lapses.
I'm not sure of the actual deadline. I'd have to defer to the General Manager of Planning and Development.
Yeah, it's in the report, January 24th.
Okay.
This is the night.
Okay, and then that is the case. It would lapse unless it is renewed prior to that.
So the motion before us would be fine. Councillor Reid would be fine then to propose a motion as well that staff report back on measures necessary, if any, to make sure that those concerns are addressed in the bylaw.
We can record that as specific direction to staff that it come back when the bylaw is
okay, with that added on then as an amendment, I support it.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Reamer.
Thank you. I just needed some clarification on paragraph 2 of page 2 of the report. Said this extension will give staff sufficient time to complete their review at least to one of these rezoning applications. And so I guess the question was going around in my mind. It's one thing to grant your extension for review of the subject amendment bylaw, but then you make reference to one of these rezoning applications, and I just wondered why we would need a year to do one. Am I reading that wrong?
I think we need a year to get one, right? Mr. McIntyre.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. That's right. The RT3 zone there was brought forward as part of the housing choices. So we had a zone there on the shelf, almost ready for use.
Right.
Meantime, we've had a number of applicants come forward. So we're thinking at least one of those would want to proceed on with the project to put that zone into effect. So in doing that, we will have it ready to go, but as well we'll address Councillor Reid's concern.
Thank
as
you.
well.
That answers my question. Thanks.
And then we can review the bylaw in the context of an actual application.
Okay.
Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'd just like some sense, if you can, of when we may expect to see it back. I understand within one more year, but hopefully sooner than that.
Through the chair, I don't have personal knowledge of those applications where we're at. We can check on that and get that information back to council. What this does, it just this extension keeps us consistent with our own procedures bylaw. At least we have now a further 12-month window to bring something forward to fill that RT3 zone.
Thank you.
Oh, and Councillor Sikora.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very simple answer. Is you know, we'll have some new 3-plexes and 4-plexes coming aboard, and that's what we'll be voting on. But anything that comes forward that's been illegal in there, the planner certainly can notify us that it's a rezoning for a 4-plex that's already non-compliance, and we can vote it down. It's very, very simple. That's just straightforward. I don't think we have to go through a whole lot of hullabaloo to get where we're going. This is a very simple one. Thank you very much.
Okay. See no other speakers. Motion is a 1-year extension. All in favor? Opposed? You're in favor? You were in favor. Okay. Motion carries unanimously. Sorry, late hand.
Item 12 is proposed amendments to the zoning bylaw to increase flexibility for subdivision-related regulations. This is Bylaw 4268. Recommendations that Council give first reading to City Coquitlam Zoning Amendment Bylaw number 4268 and refer this bylaw to public hearing.
So moved. Second.
Moved by Councillor Reamer, second by Councillor Sikora. Councillor Reid.
So any subdivision even means one big lot in central Coquitlam divided into 2 or 3 lots, correct? So when you say any subdivision, a lot of folks think that that means a whole bunch of houses. It can mean just subdivision of 1 lot into 2. And I really want to, at the public hearing, I'll support this going to public hearing, but I really want to know what you consider, and you gave some examples, I realize, but you know, a foot or 2 can make a big difference in a neighborhood, as we've seen on Schoolhouse. I remember one and a couple of others. So I'll pass this to public hearing, but hopefully that you'll have enough information to let folks know.
Sorry, I don't read it that way.
Pardon?
I'm reading the first bullet on the background. Grant the city's subdivision approving officer the discretionary ability to allow minor lot width reduction for the final lot only in a newly created subdivision.
Well, if there's only 2.
Newly created subdivision isn't necessary if it's a subdivision in an infill property. It seems to me what was intended, or at least how I read it, was that this only applies to greenfield, if you will, and doesn't apply to subdivisions of existing lots. Okay.
Your Worship, it would mean that for a subdivision application, if you're creating a new lot, it would be the last lot, be it in a parcel in the southwest or the northeast.
So an old house sitting on a 100-foot lot could come in, and the 1 lot they could vary it
within these parameters here.
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't read it that way at all. Okay.
It's tricky.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you. I'm also comfortable moving this on to public hearing, but the concern that I have is related to the discussion we had at Council and Committee, which is how do we engage people to participate in this? This is very plannerese in all of its language, and I suspect even the new councillors might even feel, I remember how I felt in the first few months and thinking, oh my God, all these words. And they're not as easy to interpret and understand. And I want to make sure that we hear from the public hearing, not just from builders and developers, because that might work for them, but I want to hear from neighbors. I want to hear from people in Old Coquitlam, where there are large lots who are going to be, who ought to expect that these lots are going to be subdivided, and I want to hear from them about what they think about this, or if they want these sorts of things to remain with council. I'm not sure how we're going to appeal to them, given the challenges we have around stuff that's even simpler than this, but I think it's really important to hear from the public. So I'm hoping our communications department can be creative with how to, I know that we're legally obligated to put out the public hearing information, blah, 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 and it's all legal language. But this is one of those where people are going to read it and go, whatever, I'm going to get back to the hockey game. But they may not realize the implications of this. So I just think that's a challenge that we're going to have. And I'll do my best on the Twitterverse to try to get people to come.
Councillor Hodge.
I'll support this going forward to public hearing, but I'm quite concerned on this one. And I think Councillor Robinson brings a good point, that if this were actually a zoning application in a specific neighborhood, and I heard this in the elections in the older parts of Coquitlam where we were doing infilling, that I think if this were tied to a specific lot, we'd be getting comments. But right now, when it doesn't pertain to somebody in a lot on their street, this is going to fly under the radar. And as soon as that somebody finds out that 2 lots were created where possibly only one because some variances were given without it going through to a public process, then I think we're going to hear about it later. And so I am concerned about that we are moving what was taking place in public into an approval process rather than a public process. So I hope that we're going to have a good, thorough discussion during a public forum on this.
Mr. McIntyre.
Your Worship, valuable feedback, and I'll relay that to the staff that were more directly involved. I guess just a couple observations. We're setting criteria, so it's no more than 10%. So it's limiting it to a fairly, minimal sort of modification. Now, the approving officer would not want to be approving lots that are inconsistent with the character of a neighborhood. So 10% is a pretty modest, at least in my view, variation. But also, you'll see in the report there too, because we want to make sure, from a staff perspective, that if there are applications, it may even be within 10%, but if it seems to be against the character of the neighborhood or it seems to be contentious, staff are glad in the approving officer role not to exercise this authority and return it back to council. Well, the applicant then could go by way of the established development variance permit process back to council. So we're going into this mindful that we don't want to be sort of overstepping what would be staff's reasonable authority as the approving officer, and recognizing where it's ultimately for those sorts of more contentious decisions that also rightly belongs at council.
Good.
I guess my concern would be it's only contentious once the public gets involved, and taking that out of the public realm, we lose that opportunity for dialogue, and that would be my concern. It's just the transparency of it is lost when we make those decisions, albeit only 10%. 10% can make a big difference to somebody in their neighborhood, and I think that when we take these decisions out of the public realm, that we lose that opportunity for that discussion.
Okay, Councillor Asmundson.
The only part I have with this issue is if we do approve this and move it forward, I'd like to have a tracking of how many of these in the first year or onward have been approved, just to get the numbers back to council. I think it's good to know that information. If this does go through public hearing and comes back and we do approve it, it'd be nice to track how many people are looking for variances and how many of these minor variances were approved by the approving officer. It'll give us an idea to maybe relook it or not in the future.
Thank you. Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you. I personally have some discomfort with the 10%. My general attitude to ideas coming forward from staff are that we should give them first reading and hear what the public has to say. But I'd like to make sure that the public is able to really understand what we're putting before them. We've given a couple of examples in the report, 701 Lee and 3380 Horizon. 701 Lee is certainly a minuscule adjustment, but 3380 Horizon is pretty close to the 10% limit. I'm wondering whether we could produce for the public hearing, and perhaps even for publication prior to that, some graphics illustrating the possibilities that exist when you're able to do that kind of. And Councillor Reid, I think, is pointing out to me that we have some there, but maybe something a little a challenge for Dan McDonald. But how do we communicate to people exactly what we're contemplating? And contemplating taking council's responsibility and devolving it to somebody else. Is this really it? Are you prepared to trust our staff, or do you want the ability to throw us out of office if you don't like what we did? Thank you.
Was that a rhetorical question?
Well, it was about other people.
Councillor O'Neill.
Yes, thank you. When I first read this information, I stumbled over the word discretionary ability to allow a minor lot with reduction. And I thought, minor? What's the definition of minor? And then just one more line down, it's 10%. And I thought, well, 10%, is that actually minor? No, it's not really minor. And I was trying to think of how to illustrate that, and Councillor Robinson talked about getting people away from their television sets watching the hockey games. Well, 10% is actually the difference between the length of a Canadian football field and an American football field. You know, the U.S. football field is 100 yards and the Canadian football field is 110 yards, and I would say that that is not a minor difference. So I don't have an objection generally about the principle of giving staff some discretion in this matter, but 10% is not minor, and it may well be that once we hear from the public on this, we might say, well, we'll go ahead with all this, but let's get a little less than 10%. We'll have to see about that. Thank you.
I suspect the council member that came in 9th in the polls by 1.5% might say that 10% is pretty significant too. Councillor Reid.
This includes all lots, so even an RS4, for instance, in New Horizons would be eligible, correct? So now, they're small lots now, and we have had public hearings here full, just for the new members of council, where there's been a lot that's, say, 89 feet wide or something, or 95 feet wide, and we could give them 2 47s or something like that. But one wasn't quite 47, it was only 45, or it became 44 or 43 by the time staff got through with figuring out how they could configure it. And the neighbors were up in arms because their lots are all 60, 80, whatever, and now they've got one that's 47 or almost 50, and then they got this little guy that's much less. And I just don't think this is the best idea we've had. And the smaller the lots that we go to subdivide, the bigger the problem's going to, the perception of the problem is going to appear. And the big problem is now when spring comes and the market starts moving, folks that want to subdivide are going to start coming in and, you know, selling and subdividing, and this happens. And the more that we redevelop the older areas from the big lots to smaller lots, the more you're going to see this. And pretty soon we're going to have people wanting to take the 100-foot lot or 120-foot lot and making 3 lots instead of 2 lots. And where does this stop? So I'm done. Thank you.
Very much. I appreciate the intent of this. In fact, I appreciate the flexibility that's intended here. And in fact, I don't really have any opposition to it. If it applied to the Greenfield as I had read it, the intent of having the 10-lot subdivision, having that one that was slightly smaller, 10% is minor, but it is significant, and nonetheless, I think that flexibility would allow perhaps better lot configurations in some cases, and you end up perhaps avoiding panhandle or whatever. So I'm interested in what the public would have to say. I will support it going to public hearing, but I do want some clarification on whether it was intended that the last lot be the second lot of a subdivision. If that was the case, then I don't support it. If it actually was intended for a larger projects, then I will listen more intently. Well, I'll listen intently anyway. Councillor Zakora has added himself. Go ahead.
Thank you. The one thing that I guess you have some applications for this kind of subdivision right now.
Through the chair, I'm not aware that we do have any particular applications right now. This was just given the recent pattern of development variance permits for lot width reductions.
And why I'm asking this, if you had one that you could get a broader circulation of letters to the residents of where it is, and a much broader circulation, maybe to say instead of maybe 50 families, maybe 300 or 400 families for the public hearing, then we'd probably get a much better kind of advice from the public what they'd go for or not. See, this one here is open, so I'd hope that if we get one, that we'd go to a much further circulation than 100 feet on either side of this, of a property owner that would want to do this, so we can get a little more publicity, a little more people talking about it. You know, I think it'd be just greater for us and the general public, okay? So we don't have the screams after that you approved it and I live a couple of blocks away and I was not notified. Thank you.
Yeah.
Your Worship, just for clarity on this one, because this is a bylaw of general application, there will not be signs or letters because there is no specific property in question. So we will work with Dan McDonald's team in order to try and develop something that pertains to this matter and go forward from there. Just wanted to be clear on that front.
Perhaps the homeowner associations.
We urge you to be creative. The motion is first reading. All in favor? Opposed? That motion carries unanimously. Going to public hearing. Mr. Kirk.
Item 13 is a preliminary report on an application for zoning amendment bylaw number 4280. This pertains to 3368 Mason Avenue. Recommendations: the council give first reading to City of Coquitlam zoning amendment bylaw 4280. That this bylaw be referred to public hearing, and that council require the owner of the proposed subdivision to provide cash in lieu.
Move the recommendation.
Moved by Councillor Zakora, second by Councillor Reamer. All in favor? Oops. Got one speaker. Councillor Reid.
You're going to miss me Monday mornings when I get to go through all this stuff with you.
Put us to the test, please.
I'm going to put you to the test. So let me just get this one straight. You've got a nice big fat lot, and you're going to have 16 fee simple parcels on it, but contained in 4 different buildings, correct? So they're going to be like 4 fourplexes. And they're not strata, correct?
That's correct.
So is there some kind of prospectus, some kind of an agreement between the owners of that building on how they're going to maintain the roof and the siding and all that stuff? And is that our responsibility or whose?
Be simple townhouse.
Yeah, it gets to, Councillor Reid's questions get to the challenges for attached housing.
Huge challenge.
Without having within a strata development. Now, it's been pointed out, though, I think, on occasion, that to allow fee simple attached row housing, they do it elsewhere, I think, in Canada certainly, and elsewhere in the world. So it's not a unique arrangement, and also too, it's pointed to as one of the means to improve housing affordability. In this case here, I found it quite interesting because we've heard from a number of people like the Michael Gellers of the world. This is one avenue that municipalities should be exploring to help promote housing affordability. So when I saw the application, I was quite curious. So I checked with staff, and yes, the developer would be required to register those reciprocal access easements that over the properties that make each abutting property owner sort of.
No, those are just easements to allow access. But I'm talking about being a realtor for 33 years. Trust me, I've seen it all. Now you have a duplex. I'll make it easy. You have a duplex, and one owner keeps his beautifully and keeps it painted. The other guy doesn't ever want to repair the roof, yet that roof's attached to the other roof. And he paints his bright orange or lime green or something, which totally upsets the whole neighborhood. Years ago in the 70s, we used to register covenants on it where we could keep, you know, the neighborhood would only be allowed to be brown and blue or something. You remember those, Richard? Mm-hmm. And those are gone by the wayside. But without strata dictating that each of these units will be kept in good repair on the outside, and that when the roof goes that everybody has to participate. We have one example of one that was done even before my time in Coquitlam that was 0 lot line, no strata, and I think we all know what's happened to that development. And lately, of course, it's been fixed up because folks have bought it and fixed them all up. But without a strata to keep these developments, I don't know how you're going to keep the neighborhood, the standard and the quality up. And I mean, speaking to Michael Geller, there are other neighborhoods that have done this, but they do have to have some agreement within the owners of the building so that they keep the neighborhood up and keep, if you're not going to go strata, I don't know what else you do, but there's got to be something between the neighbors.
Your Worship, certainly, the maintenance easement provides for, I guess, the access for that. We'd have to check and see if there's an ability through that to compel a certain, say, a standard of maintenance or appearance. There very well must. I'm sure there must be an appropriate tool there, because again, it's
a couple of them, but I want to know which one we're using. And could you have that ready for the public hearing, please? Thank you very much.
This is one of the things, back in my consulting days, did a bunch of touring of suburban Toronto, suburban Ottawa, several American cities that used fee simple townhouses, fee simple row housing, and used it very successfully. And they did have those agreements in place and of course all kinds of party wall issues, all kinds of easement issues, because all the gas meters were at one end of a townhouse building and went through all of these fee simple townhouses all the way across the block. Really fascinating, but it did have a great effect on affordability. It did allow for much improved affordability. It was townhouses on a street without that strata to have to maintain elements of the project. So I'm fascinated by this. I'm just as curious as Councillor Reid is as to which mechanism we would use to ensure that those maintenance issues get addressed, but I know they've been addressed in other jurisdictions, and I look forward to seeing what the public sees of this. I'm surprised, though, it's fourplexes, because when I first anticipated that we'd be able to introduce street townhouses to Coquitlam, I thought it would be row and not fourplex. So, Councillor Reamer.
Thank you. I recognize this developer's name, and I'm quite certain that they may have done other developments in our city. Do we not have any other fee simple developments in our city?
Through the chair. Again, when I saw the report and the proposal, I was quite curious, because it is something that we've been urged to look at. I was advised that he has a similar development next door, so we'd have to check on just what the arrangements have gone through with that one. I imagine it's the access easement, but we'll look into that, and we'll have that information for the public hearing.
Alrighty, thank you.
Okay, seeing no other questions. It's first reading this project, 16 units. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously.
Item 14 concerns the Firearm and Bow Discharge Bylaw 4266 and Bylaw Notice Enforcement Amendment Bylaw 4278. The recommendations give first, second, and third readings to Firearm and Bow Discharge Bylaw 4266 and first, second, and third readings to Bylaw Notice Enforcement Amendment Bylaw 4278. We have introductory comments by the General Manager of Engineering and Public Works.
Thanks, Your Worship. The second recommendation of the bylaw notice enforcement bylaw is essentially housekeeping. The substance of this item is the first recommendation. This is a ban on the use of bow and arrow other than in very limited circumstances on private property where it's target shooting and those persons are acting with due care and safety for others. This bylaw does not completely ban discharge of firearms because the provincial legislation allows farmers to utilize firearms for the protection of crops and livestock, so we could not go there. But in terms of banning bow and arrow, period, we feel that we're standing on good ground with this bylaw and essentially banning it from Coquitlam other than in that limited circumstance. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a couple of concerns that I wanted to raise, and I see some other council members who want to raise some too. One of them is I would like to see council write perhaps to the ministry or to UBCM or to a number of people to find out whether different rules ought to apply for urban municipalities, urban farming, and whether the rifle in an urban setting is an appropriate mechanism. We have some very, very urban blueberry farmers nestled among houses, and to suggest that they have the right to discharge a firearm, even if they're careful, troubles me. The other, a number of other elements. How did we end up with a $250 fine for shooting an arrow through a bear on a farm? It seems to me we could do a little higher than $250. That seems to be, if we were going to sell a permit to kill a bear with an arrow, it would be more than $250. And I'm kind of outraged by a $250 fine.
Thanks, Your Worship. We can certainly take that under advisement. We did a survey of, I believe, 4 municipalities who have similar bylaws, and their fines ranged from a low of 100 to, I believe, around 200. In our case, this recommendation is a $250 level. If it's not paid within 14 days, that rises to 300. But we can certainly reconsider if that is the will of Council to up that amount.
Thank you. I just... I think we have to do something, obviously, to protect our neighborhoods from this. No one would ever have anticipated, I think, on council that someone would take a bow and arrow and shoot it at wildlife on a farm or elsewhere within the city limits of Coquitlam. So, I see Councillor Reid. Well,
both of the things that you brought up, I'm concerned with. I think the fines should be much, much higher. $100 to $250 is nothing. And thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the urban slant on whether guns should be allowed to be discharged. I just think this bow and arrows and animals it's just an atrocity, and I'm very angry about this. So I would like to know if the fines could be increased to $1,000 each, at least, at a minimum.
Yep, Your Worship, we'll take that as direction to find out under the enforcement regime, the BEN enforcement regime, what is the maximum possible fine amount, and we'll take that as direction and pursue that.
And is there any way of moving also, if you're going to be inquiring on this, for someone who shoots a bear like some moron has done here and let it run around with an arrow stuck in it and in pain for weeks and weeks, is there no way that that person could also be charged with animal cruelty? Because I think that has to be part of it as well. This is just terrible. So I would like if you could sort of gather the facts. Thank you.
Well, even recovering the costs of having crews go out and try and track down the animal. Councillor O'Neill.
Yes, thank you. I have 2 main points on this one. First is that I was surprised in reading through this that to come across this line on page 3. In addition to regulating the use of bow and arrows within the city, the Firearm and Bow Bylaw removes these areas as areas where discharge of firearms are currently allowed, removes these areas as areas where discharge of firearms is permitted. I'd like to know how a notice of motion that became a motion from council, initiated by Councillor Robinson here, dealing specifically with the discharge of a bow and arrow, became a bigger bylaw to encompass the discharge of firearms and the banning of firearm discharge anywhere in Coquitlam. How did that happen?
Sure. Thanks, Your Worship. In the current firearm bylaw, there's a very small area adjacent the de Beauville Slough and heading up towards Cedar Drive that is designated as lawful for discharge of firearms. And it was a staff initiative to remove that area from the bylaw simply because there was more development in Coquitlam. I'm not sure of the exact date when this provision was there, but it's been there for a long, long time. And we know that northeast Coquitlam is developing. We just felt it was prudent to remove that area from lawful discharge of firearms. Presumably, it had something to do with hunting waterfowl at one time.
And do we know if anybody legally makes use of that area right now? Any hunters of waterfowl, let's say, making use of that in any sort of responsible way at this stage?
To my personal knowledge, no, Your Worship, we received one email today from a member of the POCO Hunting and Fishing Club, but it was a general comment. It was not specific, with respect to this area. It was just a general comment about the bylaw, and that we had not forwarded the bylaw to that club.
Okay, thank you. Now, my second comment, an area of questioning, has to do with the main thrust of this, which is the discharge of, this whole initiative advanced under the rubric of public safety. And what we have now with this bylaw, if this bylaw goes ahead, would be a situation in which we allow a farmer to discharge a firearm on his farm to protect his crops, but not allow that farmer to discharge a bow and arrow. Now, if what we are looking at is truly public safety and not some aesthetic argument about how horrible it is to look at a bear that's been wounded by bow and arrow, and if we're not looking at animal cruelty, if we are truly looking at public safety, we have to ask ourselves, what really is the safest way of getting rid of a problem animal on a farm? Is it a farmer shooting a gun at a bear and perhaps missing, and we know how far a bullet can travel if it misses its intended target, upwards of a mile, right? And this is, we're talking about the blueberry areas around Debouille Slough, and there are lots of people walking around there or riding their bikes. I know I do. If the farmer, however, shoots a bow and arrow at that problem animal and misses, that arrow only goes another couple hundred meters at the very, very most, poses, I would think, less of a danger to the public. So if the issue is public safety, then I think this is an important question. Through the Mayor, has this, to our General Manager there, has this issue been looked at? Do we truly know if it's safer to take care of problem animals with a gun than with a bow and arrow?
Well, Mr. Sousa.
Your Worship, the primary motivation for this bylaw arose out of reports of individuals on farmland shooting bows and arrows at bears. I don't know off the top of my head if farmers themselves were engaged in the activity, but there were definitely individuals on farmland essentially pursuing it as sport, if you will. And we have produced this bylaw to ban that activity. There's definitely still an issue that Mayor Stewart raises about the discharge of firearms in an urban agricultural area, but that is provincial legislation. We cannot overturn that, we can't deny that, but we can certainly seek to influence its change.
One more thing on it's the Farm Practices Protection Act, called also known as the Right to Farm Act, that we're talking about here. And actually, I don't see in there where we can specifically ban one sort of weapon and allow another sort of weapon regarding bow and arrow versus gun. I actually don't see that in there. And I have talked to some experts at the Ministry of Agriculture about this, or one expert, and he says it is a bit of a gray area. So I would imagine that there's some area in this bylaw, if we choose to go forward with it, that could be up for some question. So my reading of the law doesn't suggest that there's any difference, so that we have actually the right, that the Right to Farm Act gives farmers the right to do this.
Mr. Suzak, I won't ask you for a legal opinion.
No, thank you, Your Worship.
Okay.
Presumably any bylaw can be challenged. We have worked this file with our legal staff, and I'd be pleased to arrange for a meeting.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to get that, to raise the issue, and that you were aware of it, then that's fine. But just to conclude, my major concern is public safety here. And I'm not persuaded that it's safer to ban bow and arrows on farms and let the farmers or anybody else use guns to shoot to shoot bears. I don't think that's necessarily safer for the public. So I'll be opposing this.
Councillor Robinson, in favor.
Thank you. Well, I'm pleased to see this come forward, and I do even appreciate the extra little piece around that little firearm area. It's our community's changed since I suspect that was the case, where it was pretty rural out there, and previous councils have decided to have this part of the community less rural. We have people living there now and recreating there now. So I think it is a public safety issue. But I want to add another element to what Councillor O'Neill has suggested around public safety. It's not just about are bows more dangerous than bullets, but bears are also dangerous. And when I am concerned about when you have an injured animal running around in a public area, that too is the risk. And I am not confident that when people are bow hunting, that when they injure the animal, I think that the injured animal is also a risk to public safety. So it's not just the bow versus the bullet. It's the animal itself. If we had the capacity to not allow firearms in an urban farming community, I would go that route too. I think that there are challenges. I prefer to be consistent, but we can't. And I really appreciate our mayor's suggestion, and would like to add an element where we write a letter to the LMLGA and UBCM inviting them to explore the possibility of creating some legislation that would permit municipalities where it's more urban to ban the use of firearms. That I think that public safety needs to take precedence here, and I think it's just as we encroach on those areas, I think we have to amend some of those legislative, whatever you call them, legislative problems. So.
Okay. Is there any? I'm just going to. Is there any objection to me adding the writing of the letter into the bylaw that we're going to be voting on shortly? Is there any objection to that? You're saying no objection? Okay, the motion will include a letter to copy to UBCM and
LMLG.
Okay. So a letter to the province, copy to UBCM and LMLGA.
Yes.
Okay.
Add in what we had just discussed for the conversation.
Yes. This particular farmer invited bow hunters onto his property to hunt. This became, and for that matter, he could have charged admission. I mean, that's the kind of situation where we're in, where we could actually have hunters being invited in, or hunting clubs being invited in, whether it be by gun or by bow. And quite frankly, I don't know that it's possible to safely hunt bear by bow. I know it's not possible to quietly hunt bear by gun without the people on the dikes knowing, where I suspect it is possible to hunt by bow without the people on the dikes knowing, or to hunt in your neighborhood by bow without the children right across the fence knowing that you're doing that. And so that's among the challenges that I think get added into the mix here. I see Councillor Robinson is done. Councillor Hodge, Councillor Sikora.
I'm happy to see this finally coming forward. This is something that's concerned me for several years now, and I appreciate the amendment that we will send a letter to the provincial government, because I think that we have to look at the change of our community, because we've gone from a rural community to a more of an urban setting, and things that were fine 10 years ago, in some people's views, I don't think are accepted by society today. Certainly not in my neighborhood. 3 or 4 years ago, two of my boys came across a deer with a bow stuck in him. And aside from the emotional trauma, and then later we found a bear about 100 yards away, also dead with an arrow in it. So, you know, this is something that's been going on for a while. I dispute the safety concerns that Councillor O'Neill has brought, because I think that the difference between guns and bows isn't the distance of the projectile. It's the fact that bows can be used in the middle of the night. They can be used quietly. If somebody were today to set off a gun in my neighborhood, we'd have 4 or 5 squad cars coming up, they're code 3, a police helicopter in the air looking for the gun. But you can go out in the middle of the night or in the afternoon and shoot a bow without anybody knowing until you either find the animal or until you have an injured animal walking around in your neighborhood. And I don't see any reason to use a bow and arrow for animal control. To me, it's just cruel sport, and it has no place in my community as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Councillor Sikora.
Yeah, thank you. I take a little different view on this. The fact is that I'll tell you something. This is the first time in 40 years that I've sat here and heard of an animal being injured by a bow and arrow. So what do? Right away, we form a notice of motion. Then we have a discussion in these council chambers for about an hour and a half and 2 or 3 hours about a lousy bow and arrow being shot and an animal being injured. Then we discuss it that $200 fine is too little. Make it $10,000, make it $20,000, make it whatever. You know, I mean, go on and on and on. And how are you going to prove who shot that bow and arrow? You never will. It's silent. With a gun, at least you can hear it. The neighbors can hear it. So this is my question exactly, is how are you going to prove it? There's an animal injured with an arrow sticking out of his neck or whatever it was, okay? The first time in 40 years that we had this kind of complaint. And now we have all this real, like, bleeding hearts. You know, and frankly, I'll tell you something, it goes on too far in here. You know, all of a sudden $200 fine is not enough. Let's make it a lot higher. Let's make it $2,000. Let's make it something else, and on and on and on, over something that happened the first time in my 40 years. That's all I'm going to. And the fact is, if you've got a farm in northeast Coquitlam, sure, he's got a right to protect his property and everything else. Why not? You know, certainly. There's no two ways about it. And now we had the arrow, bow and arrow couldn't be used, and now the firearm has come into play. Next thing will be something else come into play. So I really, frankly, got a problem supporting this. Thank you very much.
I suspect the person that shot the arrow is the one that's carrying the bow. But anyway, any other discussion? Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Your Worship. The item has not been moved and seconded, and so the recommendation will be the 2 items that are before you, with the additional recommendation to write a letter to the provincial government, CC to the LMLGA and UBCM, regarding banning the use of guns in urban farm areas.
Moved by Councillor Robinson, second by Councillor Nicholson. Further discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Councillor O'Neill and Councillor Sikora are opposed. The motion carries.
Item 15 concerns the Coquitlam City Centre Library fit and finish. We have introductory comments by the General Manager of Strategic Initiatives, but the staff recommendations that Council approve the fit and finish as outlined in the report of the General Manager of Strategic Initiatives. And I invite Mr. Gravel to give some comments.
Your Worship, in 2011, Council approved the detailed floor plans outlining the library space programming. Along with the addition of the mezzanine area, the total floor space of the new library is now approximately 36,000 square feet. The interior has been designed to maximize the impression of a spacious environment, along with an abundance of natural light, and includes the following highlights. Feature ceilings in the lobby entrance and the main collection and reading room areas. A raised lounge area complete with a 5-foot electric fireplace with a feature wall. A large gallery wall to display local artworks. 3 multi-purpose rooms with articulating walls that can be opened up to create a larger area of approximately 2,600 square feet. A mezzanine area of 3,100 square feet for staff and support services, including a large public meeting room. And a space of up to 1,500 square feet to accommodate a coffee shop, which will be privately run, in which we are currently in the RFP process at this time. In conclusion, the interior fit and finish as outlined in this report will provide for a very aesthetically pleasing environment for library users, all at a reasonable cost, and has the full support of the Coquitlam Public Library Board.
Moved by Councillor Asmussen, second by Councillor Reamer. Councillor Reid.
Thank you, Your Worship. I only have one question, and it's about this slatted wood ceiling, which I believe is quite an expensive ceiling to do. But I gather now it's only in part of the library, correct?
To Councillor Reid, that is correct. The slatted roof ceiling will be over the main reading book room area only, so it is used as a feature in the library. It's not over the entire expanse, so that's one way of making it look very aesthetically pleasing at a reasonable cost.
And the reason I'm questioning it is because we have had so many roof leaks in our libraries, and a roof leaking on an expensive ceiling like this would be astronomical to keep repairing. So, any comments on that?
To Councillor Reid, we don't perceive that to be a problem because it is a structural concrete roof above this, with parking above, which has, I believe, a membrane on it. So we don't anticipate that to be a major issue. And above that floor is another outside floor, so there's many levels of protection until you get to that point. So we don't foresee that to be a major issue from a maintenance, ongoing maintenance cost or cost down the road.
I hope you're right. Thank you.
Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you. I'm glad to see that we're moving forward. I notice we say that the Coquitlam Public Library Board has reviewed the plan and are in agreement with the fit and finish plan. So in agreement is a reasonably modest statement. It doesn't say are wildly enthusiastic or anything like that. I wonder if you could identify any significant issues that arose in discussions with the library board, library staff, and their resolution.
Councillor Nicholson.
Opinion as to what's the best way to go?
Okay. Perhaps I'll ask our Manager of Facilities Planning, Mr. Brent Cormack, to address that question.
Thank you very much. The Coquitlam Library Board was presented with two options. The option they chose is the option that's put forward to you. There wasn't a significant amount of discussion. Most of it centered around the color palette. That's about it.
Sounds like a good answer. Thank you, Brent. I have one other projected completion date, fall of 2012. Is there some slippage there from where we thought we were earlier?
Yes, Your Worship. To Councillor Nicholson, when we were doing the space planning, the issue was raised by Council, perhaps including the addition of a construction of a mezzanine into this building. Currently, the building does not have a mezzanine, and a report was brought forward to Council, and Council did approve the inclusion to the scope of work, adding to the scope of work, a mezzanine structure of approximately 3,100 square feet at a cost of $650,000. That in turn provided more space, which means we had to go back to do the space planning, discuss it with the library board, et cetera, et cetera. Going through that process, all in all, we lost almost 3 months. The bad news is that has slipped the schedule back by about 3 months. The good news is the Coquitlam Center Library has 3,100 square feet more space of programming. They're very pleased with that. So from that perspective, it's still a very positive attribute, and we don't feel that the slippage of 3 months is significant in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Ravel. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. Councillor Sikora.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you have 1,500 square foot coffee shop in the library, in the new library. We have a coffee shop right here at the City Hall. So that means that we're going to have 2 coffee shops within a block of each other on city property, on city-held space. And I just have a great difficulty with that, because I can tell you something, that possibly both of them will fail. It'll be very costly to the taxpayers of this community, and I don't think that that's what we should be doing, is having, in the library a block away, a coffee shop, and here's just right down in the City Hall in the basement, we have on the main floor a coffee shop. So I'm just saying this, that, coffee shops are not a very profitable business. And I can tell you something, that you can fail in both of them, and then who's going to pay for that? So I'm really, really concerned with that.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking forward to this. Looking forward to this process completing. I know the discussion over the coffee shop, for example. I guess the private market will determine what the lease rate is for a coffee shop and a library on a main street. Pretty close to a SkyTrain line. And I look forward to seeing where that one goes. I actually have lots of confidence that will be able to work and that the lease rate will reflect the profitability of a coffee shop in that location. So I'm comfortable there. And I did want to acknowledge Rhiannon Pipperell, Ms. Coquitlam Public Library herself, who's here primarily to make sure we all vote the right way. Okay, she's flexing her muscles back there. Okay. So, seeing no other discussion. Is there a motion yet? It is.
Your Worship.
Moved and seconded. It's already there. All in favor? Opposed? You don't have to muscle any of us out. Carried unanimously.
Thank you. Moving on to item 16, which is a notice of motion concerning by-elections. This was introduced by Councillor Asmundson, who will have the privilege to speak first if he wishes to activate his microphone. Following a series of whereas clauses, the therefore be resolved clause are therefore be resolved that the provincial government consider the introduction of legislative amendments to the existing Local Government Act which permit local governments greater flexibility to deal with council vacancies that arise during a term of office in order that local taxpayers are not forced to incur the high costs associated with holding a by-election, and therefore be it further resolved that this resolution be submitted to the LMLGA for its consideration and support at its annual meeting, and request that be forwarded by that organization to the UBCM at their annual 2012 convention.
Well, thank you very much.
Seconded, Councillor Asmundson.
Well, thank you very much. This is a concern because we've had a by-election the last two times in two elections, and the cost involved for the City of Coquitlam was not insignificant. And the last election, the by-election, we had some issues about how councils should deal with by-elections, how we could minimize the cost, but we are already into the process of dealing with the by-election. So I thought now that would be a better time at the beginning of our mandate to ask the provincial government to look at this issue, whether you wanted to set up a system, let's say, where the local governments, the provincial government contribute to a fund to BC elections to help cover the cost of by-elections. Whether you, at say a 6-month or year term, you can take the 9th person on the list to save. These are issues for the provincial government to look at. We've just had up in, I think it was Linton, where a mayor and a councillor quit within 1 month. You know, I think in those cases there, that's an act of irresponsibility. I don't know what the full deal is there, but there should be some sort of fine imposed. But when people are moving up to other levels of government, whether it's provincial, federal, I think that's staying within public service. There's nothing wrong with that opportunity moving up. But I think when people run for office, then simply quit, I think there should be like a $10,000 fine or something to those people, because when you take on the role of council or mayor, there's responsibility to stick it out for your whole term and not quit because you maybe not got an issue that you wanted through. I think we've all suffered defeats on issues that we felt very passionate about and stuck with it. But I think this is something for the UBCM, MLGA, and at the end of the day, the provincial government, they're coming forward with legislation on the Local Government Act for the election and our process of how we at municipal level are elected. So I think this is timely to ask them to look at this and come up with some methods to help deal with by-elections. Thank you.
Very good. Councillor Sikora.
Yeah, thank you very much. This one I have really a lot of mixed feelings with it, although it sounds good. But however, how are you going to, you know, let's say you have a vacancy in a year from now or 6 months from now. How are you going to replace? And, you know, there's comments of, well, the person that was the bottom that was almost elected but didn't get elected should be in. Or somehow that we should maybe appoint somebody. Now, I can imagine in this council chambers, if we started to choose who should be appointed, who shouldn't be appointed, that would take at least a couple of weeks of discussion anyway, because everybody would be pumping for their friends, you know. But in any case, I think that that's wrong. Secondly, you know, if there's a vacancy within 6 months of election, then you don't have to replace the council member or the mayor or whoever it may be, you know, because you can carry on. But certainly, you know, you know, that's a cost of doing government business by going to a public for election. And I see nothing wrong if we have a vacancy in these council chambers, and you know, we've had 2 or 3 that have gone, you know, federal politics or provincial and left the council chambers, and it's great to have somebody of that quality that's wanted by somebody else, whether it be provincial or federal. Wouldn't it be something that if nobody ever got asked to run provincially, federally at these council chambers, it'd be pretty boring. That means we have a dead council. That's exactly what I would say, that they don't fit anywhere. But anyways, you know, to me, it's a way of doing business with the government. It's the taxpayers, this community have a right to pick the person they want them to represent them in the council chambers. I don't see us getting into it to dictate who's going to be the next council member or mayor, if there should be a resignation. Neither do I think for 1 minute that we should be picking anybody. I think it's up to the taxpayers. And, you know, we're talking about $250,000 election. That doesn't have to be a $250,000 election by far. But what we do in the by-election, we seem to have the pocket full of people that want a day's pay to work in an election office. And they're all there from year to year, and the same people over and over and over again. See, well, maybe we in a by-election, we only need half of them. Maybe a quarter of them would do it. Because the last time we had a by-election, it was 5% of people turn out. So why are we spending $250,000? And I don't know whether it was $125,000 or $250,000, but I knew that $250,000 had been bounced around a few times around these council chambers. And I think that, you know what, who am I to have to say to the taxpayers, this person will sit. He's not elected body, but he'll sit, make all the decisions on behalf of the taxpayers, up their taxes and do a lot of other things and not be elected body. And I think that's very, very unfair. And you don't do business that way. I'm sorry, so I cannot support it. Unless I have right in my hands, what is it that we're trying to do? And we can talk about a $10,000 fine again, up at the $50,000 fine. Yeah. Throw the guy in jail maybe, and then he won't be able to run. I mean, really.
I don't think that's a very good
Thank you very much. Well, it is fair.
The proposal is to ask the provincial government to consider some options, and I think that the options typically that are discussed is the 9th one, which is someone that did go through an election and did score quite well in an election, or to let the council seat remain vacant. That's the other pretty common one, is that that under certain parameters you can let the council seat remain vacant. So I think neither of those is particularly undemocratic, and both of them. I also want to comment on the cost. I know by-elections we do cut down on the costs quite significantly. And Mr. Gilbert.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, we do. The budgeted amount that is allocated is around $250,000. We have a process by which we draw that from reserves. But over the last 2 by-elections, it has been more around the $125,000 to $150,000 range. We reduced the number of polling stations because the turnout is smaller. And what we have started to do is negotiate the contracts based upon our regular election, that they go for a 3-year period of time, and we get to reuse the software for free if a by-election occurs within that period. So we've now been able to start to reduce the costs considerably from what they would have been before. But that being said, there are certain, whether you have a by-election with 5% turnout or you have 1 candidate, 2 candidates, or 20 candidates, some of the costs are just the costs because the infrastructure has to take place to make it happen. So there's some savings, and it's about 50%, but it turns out to be about $125,000 to $150,000.
Thank you. Councillor O'Neill.
I know this is an issue, and it's one definitely worth exploring. And a couple of questions, I don't know who I'd ask this to. I guess maybe specifically whether or not what we're talking about here is asking the provincial government to look at just the replacement of councillors or mayors as well. We're being very, very general here. And of course, all we are doing is asking them to consider the introduction of something. I would like a little more clarity on that. So dealing with mayors or mayors and councillor, some ideas, you just mentioned a couple of ideas, Your Worship. It might also be an opportunity for the provincial government to look at alternative ways of voting. I think it was Councillor Reamer was at the UBCM convention put forward, or was a supporter of a motion that talked about electronic voting. I'm not sold on that idea, but maybe in a by-election, electronic voting could be used. And once that system gets established, it would be probably pretty low cost to do that, instead of having polling stations and all the personnel that's needed to staff those. So those are some ideas. I think this is, in one way, it's a very general, and it's somewhat harmless as well. It's encouraging the provincial government to look at some of the options. I don't think it's going to do any harm to do that. I'd be happier if it's maybe a little more specific, but I'll support the motion because it's just to get people thinking about it and to get some momentum behind it. Sure.
Thank you. Councillor Reamer.
Thank you. Well, I fully support this. I seconded it. I think we have to start general, because if we start general, we can move to specific. If we start specific, we can't move back to general. So this gives us a little bit more flexibility, and the government a little bit more flexibility. I think, as Councillor O'Neill has suggested, that it is harmless, and that I think only good can come out of it. I would be interested in knowing, I know the City of Vancouver did an online voting trial in their advance polls in this last general election, and I'd be interested in finding out from them how that went. And I think the use of online voting in a by-election as well is a great idea. So thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Reid.
Well, I'll support this again. We've done it before, and Councillor O'Neill and I spoke to the Premier about it. She didn't think it was a bad idea. You know, for us, it's expensive. No matter if it's $100,000 or $200,000, it's still expensive, and it's a long process to go through. And if in the first year or so of the term, and it's not our place to decide what the rules should be, but it's the province's place to decide. But we're just giving them suggestions, and this just makes common sense to me. But when you hear of a smaller city that loses 1 or 2 councillors, I mean, that could be devastating. The cost of that alone to them could bankrupt their city. I mean, some of it gets really, really expensive. And I think this is a very basic common sense suggestion, that the government change the legislation to have some flexibility for councils to either run with who they've got or take the last person if it's in with a specific length of time. And that's all we're asking, and I think it's just plain common sense.
Thank you. I had my own comments. The last by-election, we actually asked the provincial government, we were faced with a by-election, we asked the provincial government, is there some other alternative? For example, could you simply appoint whoever came in ninth in the previous election, and that particular person we knew to be willing to serve, and probably a pretty good candidate since he's back on council. No, we were told we had to go through the by-election. We went through a $250,000 or $150,000 by-election, and that same person was the one that won the by-election and served on council. If it became part of the law that automatically the next person, if it's a 5-member council, then the 5th council candidate was the alternate, was kind of the sitting there and waiting, the 7th or the 9th, depending on how many council members are in council, a given council. It just became automatic that your runner-up is sitting there waiting in the wings in case of the accidental and mysterious death of one of the council members. Then it would simply allow that municipalities would have some ability to not incur that extra cost. If, for example, we went to 4-year terms. 4-year terms means perhaps almost doubling the likelihood of a by-election, because right now you don't have to have a by-election in the last year of your, because the Act simply says if it's within a year of your election, you don't have to have a by-election. But if you increase that to the first 2 years becomes the first 3 years, then I think you've almost doubled the likelihood that you're going to have by-elections in communities. And that cost is enormous. And I think this one measure, simply taking the 9th, would have allowed us to have $400,000 to do some good work in our community with, rather than continually re-electing Councillor Nicholson. Not that that wasn't worth every penny we paid. So, and now's the right time. Now's the time. There's no personalities involved. There's no individuals that have. It's simply this theoretical. What happens if in New Westminster? What happens if in Burnaby? What happens if in Coquitlam or Port Moody? This is the right time to ask for it, and I think asking in a general way allows the provincial government to find solutions that are general, whereas asking specifically grant the mayor the right to appoint, that would be silly, I think. It would be absolutely, it has to be a democratic process, either allowing a council to forego having another council member to run with what they have for the remainder of the term, or allowing someone whose position was chosen by the voters in the previous election, both of which I think would be an acceptable solution, and now's the right time to ask. Councillor Robinson.
Thank you. Well, I do appreciate that we are asking now. I think it's lessons learned. We got caught last time, and I appreciate Councillor Asmussen and Councillor Reamer bringing this forward. I'm going to fully support it, especially given that our taxpayers were really clear with us during this last election to cut expenditures wherever possible. This is one of those places where if we didn't have to put aside money for a potential by-election, we could save some money. This is one of those places that, to me, makes the most sense, and I hope the province uses its power and its wisdom to support some sort of change to the legislation that would help us save the taxpayers some money.
There you go. And no other discussion. The motion is Councillor Asmussen's notice of motion regarding by-elections. All in favour? Opposed? Councillor Sikora is opposed. The motion carries.
On the table.
And Councillor Reid.
This is around the table.
Oops, sorry, we have one more item.
There's one more item. I'm sorry.
And oddly enough, you're related to it. So.
The bear.
Item 17 is the Metro Vancouver Board and Brief from their meeting of December 16th. We have our Metro Vancouver Board representatives here, and the recommendation to answer questions, and the recommendation is that Council receive this brief for information.
Moved by Councillor Reamer, seconded by Councillor Robinson. All in favour? Opposed? Carried unanimously. Councillor Reid.
I know Councillor O'Neill's going to love this one again. It's to do with bears. Mr. Susak, our engineer, has been the most tolerant and wonderful of people to have put up with the inquiries that I've been getting about the bears that have been killed. And I guess sometime in September or October, I had several people asking about what happens to the bears and the bodies and the bear parts and all of that. And Mr. Susak has done a lot of work on getting information as best we can. I guess on the weekend there were 3 bears killed, which brought everybody to the fore again, and the answers that we've been getting are not enough. The answers that we got were that the bears their bears' bodies are disposed of in unnamed places in the wilderness, that the skins of the bears may be used and given to the Aboriginal folks for purpose, I guess for ceremonial purposes or whatever, but it has not answered the question that there's a big suspicion out in the animal kingdom around the lower mainland about how come so many bears are getting killed and what happens to all the bear parts that are worth thousands and thousands of dollars, and where are they going, and is someone making a profit off them? Now, as awful as it is to think about this, one of the people said, well, how come they can take a bear from Vancouver at the post office in the middle of Georgia Street, get him in a cage and get rid of him, and yet they'd have to take a mom and 2 cubs and shoot them in Port Coquitlam? And I don't know the answers to this, and I find it disgusting if stuff like this is happening, but I don't know what the answers are. And Mr. Susak, I forwarded him a great mass of rules and regulations, and all I can do is actually formally request a letter from, I'm not sure where, maybe Mr. Susak can enlighten us, and I would like council support to have a letter go out and ask if we can either have Mr. Stevens, who is our conservation officer, come and appear before us, or something to put this to bed once and for all. So, Mr. Susak, if you can enlighten us a bit more, I'd appreciate it.
Mr. Stevens is our Bear Aware coordinator. Mr.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Staff have contacted Coquitlam RCMP on this issue to find out whether or not there have been any reports, regarding illegal trade in bear parts, and they have confirmed that no, they haven't received any of that. It would be a criminal matter, and if anyone feels that they have concerns or evidence or whatever, we would encourage them to contact Coquitlam RCMP, and they would take that potential criminal matter at that point. We've had a lot of discussions with the provincial conservation officer representatives. They essentially have 2 ways of disposing of bear carcasses. One is they might incinerate it, depending upon the condition of the body or what have you. And the other disposal method is to a wilderness location. They are reluctant to divulge exactly where they go, specifically for the concerns about attracting people who might want to try and source that carcass or parts of the carcass. I'm happy to get back to them and say we would like to have a more formal letter and or delegation presentation to have a discussion about this matter. We can arrange it to have our own Drake Stevens there at that time as well.
Thank you. This is just getting legs, and I mean, folks all over are asking, and people can't seem to believe that if these bear parts are so valuable that they're actually getting buried intact. So I would appreciate having a letter from whomever, the powers that be. So I would move that we ask the province for a letter to try and allay the fears of our citizens and those of our surrounding communities.
I'll second that.
Thank you.
Okay. Motion from Councillor Reid, seconded by Councillor Sikora. Is there any discussion on the motion? All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously. Councillor Reid, are you done?
Thank you, Council.
Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you, Your Worship. The clerk was kind enough to remind me that I emailed everybody last week about the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Sustainable Communities Conference, which comes up in about 3 weeks. Council's our policy provides that any of us may attend the annual conference of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the UBCM, and the Local Mainland Local Government Association. But for any other travel outside the province, we need the permission of Council. What I suggested in my email was that the Sustainable Communities Conference is of considerably more interest to me than FCM's annual conference, even though it's being held in Saskatoon, close to Councillor Sikora's hometown birthplace. So I would prefer to attend the Sustainable Communities Conference, but I need your permission to do that, and I would cheerfully give you my undertaking not to go to Saskatoon to the FCM.
And to report back on the wonderful findings that you
And to report
discovered.
back on just how we can be even more sustainable than we already strive to be.
On this one, I suspect the better way to approach it may well be to have our policy reflect that any approved or sanctioned UBCM or FCM conference is what was meant by the policy, or what is now meant by the policy, and that the policy would reflect that a council member could choose to go to any but one sanctioned FCM conference, as well, in addition to UBCM or LMLGA.
Well, I'd be happy to have the mayor interpret the policy for me.
No, that's not how I'd interpret the policy as it's written now, but I'd like to see us amend it if that's council's wish. The motion is to amend the policy to reflect that. It's seconded by Councillor Robinson. Any discussion on that?
I believe the speakers list may be in relation
speakers
to
list
this.
is along that. Is along. Oh, okay.
So I'll.
Are any of these speakers on that subject? Okay, Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, and I appreciate Councillor Nicholson bringing this forward, and Your Worship mentioning the idea of reporting back, because to me that's key. I'm actually thrilled to have somebody representing us go there, but for me what's important is come back with the information, share with us what you've learned, bring back materials so that we can all benefit from that. And I would actually want that as a requirement for any of those kinds of specialty, well, I'll call them specialty conferences, that the requirement is that you come back and that you find, we allocate 30 minutes or whatever it is to report back what you've learned, and you share materials, because I think that's the whole reason for it.
Absolutely. Councillor Emer on this subject.
Thank you. I too was pleased when I read Councillor Nicholson's email, and I actually had looked at that myself because I thought it sounded very interesting and would be very beneficial to our citizens and having this information via yourself. So I fully support you going. Thank you.
Councillor Asmussen.
I guess my only comment is, do we need to travel for sustainable? We have sustainable cities conferences in Vancouver. We've had them in the past. Just recently we partnered, I think, for this year or last year with SFU on some sustainable cities and through Metro Vancouver. So I always don't know, do we need to travel to do all these things? And I mean, most of our UBCM conferences or LMLGA have, sustainable city issues within the seminars that we go to. So if you want to go, but I don't know if it's necessary that, and I think if we can source out either this year or next year locally sustainable cities here that are going to be, we should be doing that instead. And once again, it's about cost. Do we need to do these?
Yep. Okay. Actually, I have no concern whatsoever. I suspect that each council member would make the decision based partly on they don't want to waste their time unless it's an exotic city like Saskatoon or something. I can't imagine a council member deciding that Ottawa is the place they want to spend their vacation at a Sustainable Cities Conference in February. Councillor O'Neill.
Yeah, just a quick comment. When we ran an election on our campaigns last fall, each of us had a particular platform advancing ideas, advancing policies that we were passionate about. And I believe that I recall that Councillor Nicholson talked a lot about the environment and sustainability, so I think the voters know what they were getting when they voted for him and they put him in office, and I think it's appropriate. If he feels it's important enough, they've given him their trust for him to make his decisions.
There you go. The motion is change in policy to any sanctioned FCM conference. All in favor? Opposed?
Yes, the policy currently says the FCM annual conference only. So what we will change it to is one FCM sanctioned event, I think is.
There you go. I'm going to do that again because some people were distracted. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously. A motion to adjourn would be in order. Moved by Councillor Robinson, seconded by Councillor Asmussen. All in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously. Yes.